Okay, so, and the light? But can we get a little bit more light, or is there? I'm just scared that it'll get dark as the evening goes on. I don't like seeing myself like this.
I don't think there's much we can do about it.
Yeah, no, those days are long gone. I always just usually say to, I have a friend, Ava, and we always walk around, no one even pays attention to us anymore, right? Those days are long gone.
How does it feel?
Well, it does feel a little weird, because I used to, if I would walk into the room, people would turn and pay attention. But in some ways, it's liberating, because then I don't have to worry about, what I look like or how fancy. I mean, I still want to look nice, but it's like,
We're on stream already, so.
yes, I should.
We should not talk about it.
You're not going to introduce me, are you?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, then I should sit down.
No, but then I will be very short.
You can start now.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to see most of you back after swimming and the walking tour. I hope your presence will be equally or even more impressive tomorrow at our roundtable. And it is my joy to introduce Marta very briefly and to tell you that Marta is a professor in the sociology department at the University of California, San Diego. Don't be misled. She's very much into political economy, feminist science studies, and social history. And I think her work is a stepping stone for anyone who is interested in commodification of labor and in the establishment of regimes of value, not only in Eastern Europe, but probably everywhere. And that's all I'm going to say about her. And today she's going to talk about jokes.
Yes. Should I go? Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I should start out by saying some of these jokes will not be they'll be a bit vulgar. But someone was making fun of Hungarian jokes as vulgar, and I go, really? Yeah. Anyway, it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so pleased to have been included in this great conference, and I've learned so much. And just the joy of meeting people who are as committed as I am to understanding what everyday socialism is like is just a treat. So my comments today will be based on several different kinds of evidence. My field work for my dissertation became a book. I conducted 2 years. I lived in a village in Hungary in 2 years between 82 and 84. And the topic was looking at how collectivization changed people's attitudes about work, and made the argument in that book that labor had been commodified in socialism without a market. And when I mean commodified, I mean that people understood their time to have, or their labor to have a temporal duration and a monetary value, that they had really rethought. Since then, I've done, and then my more recent book is called The Value of Labor, because I was very curious about the wage form that they used in the cooperative farms, which I thought was suspiciously, it looked like a lot of scientific management from the 1930s. So the second book I published more recently, called The Value of Labor, is about how the entire wage system of cooperative farms in Hungary was based and actually constructed by what I would consider very conservative Catholic work scientists, Betriebswirtschaft, who were very much committed to large-scale agriculture, wanted to get rid of the stupid peasant. They wanted California agriculture, just large manorial estates. They weren't successful during the war before the war because of the inadequacy of what I would think of as the infrastructure. And so everyone, and other people said, well, I'm not going to hire a steward. I'm not going to do cost accounting. Who's the idiot who's going to pay for that in the 1930s, right? So, but after the war, the Communist Party came in and said, we want a scientific wage. And of course, that's what they've been working on. So actually, several what would be considered class enemies wrote and designed the wage form in about 6 weeks. So the book is about how they think about the value of labor, how they design the wage, and then how it's implemented to see what happens. And that's a further extension, again, about the argument that you have to create an infrastructure to create the opportunity for a labor market. Labor markets are not self-evident. So, and it's about the infrastructure, which is related to my other work, which I published a book in 2009 on standards and infrastructure with Lee Starr. And now I'm working on a book on satirical magazines published by political parties. I like to jump proud. Besides the work that I've done on agrarian communities, I've also done some historical work on the 19th and 20th centuries. Wrote an article about gender in the state, an article about the longue durée of state formation, some work on calorie money, and time management studies. And my personal experience in socialism is based, I'm dating myself, of course, for having lived in Hungary for almost 50 years, on and off. I first went to Hungary as an undergraduate in 1973. So, and with no knowledge of Hungarian, and I had a great time. Anyway, so as I remember once I was talking to a friend of mine who does work in Japan, and I was spending an hour and a half, all these awful things are happening in Hungary, and she goes, why do you go there? I go, but I love the place. So, as I pondered the possible topics I could present today, I realized that I'm talking to a very knowledgeable audience, right, whose research on everyday socialism extends far beyond mine. So rather than develop some grand narrative about everyday socialism based on my more limited research, so much of my work recently has been historical, I decided I would just put together 3 thoughts, these issues that I care about very strongly, and use jokes to illustrate the point. I will jump first and make a very important caveat that the jokes that I'll be telling you are primarily urban jokes. They have a different style, right, than many jokes. And there are all kinds of arguments about why urban jokes are different, but jokes in the village are not like the jokes in the city. So they're far less about hypocrisy and bureaucratic nightmares and more about sex and priests, right? So here's an example. So 3 young men have been committing adultery in the village, right? And they decide that they're going to go and tell the priest, they're going to confess to adultery, but they're not going to tell the priest who they're having affairs with. So the 3 guys are out in front of church, and the first guy goes in, and he said, well, my father, I have sinned. I don't know what, I'm not Catholic, sort of. And he said, I've been committing adultery. And he said, well, who with? And I said, well, I can't tell you that. So the priest said, well, was it Marika at the end of the village? No. Was it Juji in the middle of the village? No. Was it Teri at the other end of the village? No. And he goes, well, my son, I can't absolve you if you don't tell me their names. So he comes out, and the other 2 guys are waiting. Well, what happened? What happened? He goes, well, he didn't absolve me, but I got 3 good addresses. Right? So that's the kind of joke that, but I mean, essentially, I don't know whether I was able to remember jokes before I went to Hungary, but it was very obvious early on that people would spend a lot of time telling jokes. And it was so much fun that people would, we'd be talking about everyday things, and then they'd pause and, well, let me tell you a joke. Right? So clear enjoyment, lots of laughter. And of course, for an anthropologist, they're amazingly, they're a treasure trove of all kinds of information, right? They reflect all kinds of popular sentiment, cultural attitudes, political views. In the 1980s, people still didn't have telephones pretty much, right? So at least among intellectuals, it was very common for people to just show up in the evening with a bottle of wine on someone's door, you know, because intellectuals didn't have to work that hard, so they could take free time. And everybody would just sit down and keep up on current rumors and tell jokes all night long, right? It was such a pleasant experience. That world is no more. And actually, I've written an article about why jokes disappeared after 1989. I wrote it with Maya Nadkarni, so if you're interested in that, it's available. So you did have to spend a lot of time learning how to tell jokes, right? The social skills, when and where you might be able to do this, right? And for more professional cartoonists or other jokesters, figuring out how to decide what could be printed this week, what not, you know, what were the censors going to control and so on, was a very complex dance, which Neringa Klimbiti, who just has published a great book on jokes and authoritarianism, refers to as political intimacy. That the censors and the writers had this very deep kind of complex relationship that was very close and constantly was shifting depending on it, right? Very emotionally laden milieu, right? What's risky this week, what's not. So it was an ongoing kind of project. So I love to tell these jokes, and most everybody understands them. I must say, I gave my talk about jokes in Hungarian at the economics university a couple of years ago, and the young people didn't get any of the jokes. It was I was so used to having people laugh, and nothing. Although if my friends who were there said they probably learned more about socialism than they ever heard before. But anyway, so I thought that what we would think about is there's some issues that are expressed in jokes and are very, hit the point in a very effective way. But I also want to suggest that a lot of jokes actually distort the way in which life was lived in socialism. And you would know that at the time. So if someone told you a joke and you understood the exaggeration, but it means that we have to take them with a grain of salt as historical artifacts, because they might not necessarily express it. So, for example, what's the difference between democracy and socialist democracy? Well, it's the difference between fucking and getting fucked, right? Now this is a classic urban joke, short, succinct, right, very clear. And it captured people's sentiments about what it was like to live in socialism. But this is not a sentiment that would be ever restricted to people who live in socialist societies. You could immediately imagine all kinds of people in other societies who would have the same experience. A poor person in the United States and the way that they're treated in welfare offices, for example, refugees. I mean, this is not solely a socialist experience, but it felt real to people who were living there. And it was very clever too, right? I mean, it's characteristic about places where people have conditions of stark inequality and limited political participation in public life, and that's true in capitalist as well as socialist societies. So I want to make sure that caveat is there. And further and more, I think it's important to follow Michael Burway and Janusz Lukac's cautionary note that they wrote in an article where we need to be sure that we are not comparing actually existing socialism with idealized capitalism, which was often the case. When people would make these, well, capitalism, it must be, and it's like, no, that's not what it's like. Yeah. So I propose to organize my comments around three issues: one on socialist state formation, another on class dynamics, and then a commentary about morality and politics in late socialism. So I'll start first with classic state formation. So many of you may know that there used to be a genre of jokes called Radio Yerevan, which didn't exist, right? But everybody knew it was always, you'd say one thing and it would be contradicted and back. So here's a classic joke. So is it true that Mayakovsky was assassinated? And what were his last words? No, he wasn't assassinated. He committed suicide. And his last words were, "Don't shoot, comrades," right? So again, it kind of carries a lot of the feeling that a lot of people had during that period, in the early Stalinist period, right? a lot of violence, a lot of state repression. And I think for a lot of people, the kind of context and the way in which people lived the party state in Eastern Europe in Stalinist period was one of violence and repression. You deport wealthy people, former army officers, families to the countryside, forced deliveries, of course, for people who were living in the countryside and had their wheat and corn and sugar beets taken away, and of course, massive incarceration. Right? So people would, the secret police would show up at your house in the middle of the night, and you wouldn't know why you were being arrested, and you'd end up in jail. Now, after Nagy Imre came back to power in 1953, he released 93,000 political prisoners. And it became very obvious that people realized how arbitrary so many of these incarcerations had been. And Benjamin, who was a famous poet, wrote in 1954, "I was guilty because I believed in your guilt." So people became very aware of the arbitrary character of state control. So when you talk to people about that period, many people remember all the chaos and the pain. But I would submit to you that much that went behind the closed doors of state bureaucracy resembles the fits and starts of modernizing state offices you can see anywhere. If one pages through government documents, which I did a great deal for the Scientific Management Project, you could see documents that you would see very easily at the Department of Agriculture in the United States. So you have the minutes of department meetings, what was and wasn't accomplished, who needs to follow up with one particular problem or the other. All the documents, reports that are generated when a new policy is being devised. They send it off to experts, they give feedback. Queries from bureaucrats and other agencies at the national level about different shared tasks, and there's often confusion about those issues. Requests for clarification. I looked at the materials in the labor office, and people from the countryside would say, is this really how you want us to calculate the wage? Don't you think that it would be better if we calculated this? So a lot of just everyday back and forth. But a lot of this work was invisible. People were not aware of this absolutely mundane process of building a modern state. It took place behind closed doors, and in some cases was shrouded in secret. So I made an effort when I was reading these to read as I would any other kind of document, that they are documents that are posturing, they're advancing an agenda, there's falsification. I mean, one archival director said, "You can't believe anything that's in those papers." Well, I strongly suspect in the Department of State, there are lots of documents like that too, right? So reading documents to understand their role in a particular bureaucracy has to be much more reflexive. So I want to make 2 points that are relevant here when thinking about the apparent chaos and confusion that people experienced. First, the new party state had taken on massive responsibilities by adopting centralized economic planning. It's far more demanding than a simple bureaucratic reform. You had to redesign entire ministries, creating new ministries. And of course, a lot of this was a learning process, so it had to be done again and again and again through the early 50s. The Hungarians apparently were very good at creating new ministries because the Soviets complained that the Hungarians had more ministries than they did in the Soviet Union. And of course, you'd have new offices that were created to address specific issues, often without clearly delineating responsibility between different agencies. So often you would have clashes between groups. There's a classic anecdote about a person coming who was collecting food, had a run-in with a person who was in charge of forced deliveries. And the man came to a house and he wanted to get the cow, but the cow was completely emaciated and he refused to take it. And the forced delivery guy said, well, that's irresponsible, so he had him shot. So there are lots of problems of people, who's responsible and who can exercise certain kinds of powers. And of course, you also had the basic interpersonal squabbles you have in any community, right? I would read, letters. At one point, Getter wrote a letter. Getter, who was the kind of industrial specialist, or minister, wrote a letter to the Erde, who is the Minister of Agriculture, and he says, "You're a class enemy. You're betraying the state," because he didn't agree with the way in which decisions were made in the budget that was privileging the Ministry of Agriculture. So, and of course, the tasks were also complicated by very frequent changes in policy to adjust to shifting political strategies and alliances, right? At the same time, there was a lot of pressure to rationalize the bureaucracy itself, right? There was constant attempts to rein in the beast, right? People were very concerned. This is already true in 45, 46. We have to build this new state, but all the parties insisted on having their representatives in different parts. So you had a much larger bureaucracy than you might have needed, right? And still they kept on trying to pull it back. In 1951, there was a lack of paper, so it made it very difficult for bureaucratic tasks. So, and at one point, Rákosi complains to Erde, Rákosi, the first secretary, complains to the Minister of Agriculture that he's issuing too many directives. He said, "You're issuing more directives than any other ministry." Well, the Ministry of Agriculture was not just an institution in charge of overseeing kind of collectivization. It was also a special interest community. So he had double tasks that he had to pay attention to, and so that accounts for perhaps more, why he sent out more directives. So in any case, it was a very daunting task to build this new state. Then, of course, the second issue is to think about how people were staffing these offices, right? You could have relied on some people who were very eager and excited about the possibility of developing new social policies, which is true of a lot of people, at least in the first couple of years of 1950s. But in other contexts, you might have had to rely on people who were not even sympathetic, certainly not enthusiastic. So you had a difficulty of finding people who were willing to conduct or do the task effectively, right? And oftentimes, because there was this huge confusion and all these different lines of authority and directives, people were overwhelmed with the amount of paper at the local level, for example, overwhelmed by all the paper that they had to work through, right? At one point, there's a quote from a guy working, and he said, "What am I, a mailman?" He said, "I can't take all this," because every ministry sent down the materials, and of course, it all funneled down to this one little guy in the village, right? So it became very difficult for people to keep up with all the changes and regulations, right? So many bureaucratic offices were full of overworked and less than enthusiastic people. Again, not a good situation for building up a new state. Whether it be local level bureaucrats at the county level or party operatives or agitprop personnel, right? Who often just went through the motions, right? You could see in the documents, they would have this consistent phrase. They said, "Yes, we went in, we discussed the issues with people there, and they all agreed." It's the exact same text, and what that meant was they went, had a beer, and then they left. They didn't talk to anybody, right? It was so a lot of the work wasn't done very effectively. You also had the phenomenon of what they call in Hungary little kings. So because things were chaotic, you could have local officials who became very despotic in controlling things on the local level. And they could be perhaps are responsible for some of the anarchy and brutality that people experienced, and not so much from the central state, right? And of course, there are also occasions where people just blew off the directives entirely. It was cooperative farms were supposed to have party secretaries and departments as of 1949. And in some counties where you had this very, serious kind of communist, you had that in 1949, and in Zola, which is off in this corner, it's a kind of a mining region, not very good soil. In 1953, they said, well, maybe we should get around to having a party secretary, right? So across the country, you had very different ways in which people would think about their responsibilities. You also had the problem, going back, if we think at the central level, that you have very serious economic problems to solve. And there were very few people who were qualified to do anything close to historical material, anything close to a Marxist-Leninist analysis of economic issues. Right? So often, very common class enemies, effectively, people who were known to be not very sympathetic to the cause, would be hired to do the planning. Right? They'd say, well, if this person isn't so bad, you know, but they know what they're doing. Right? So you had this whole very complex thing. So the idea that all the people who ended up in the bureaucracy were, you know, these, I don't know, working class guys, it's just not true. You'd have a few people at the top, but then you have a lot of people, very strong continuity in personnel. And it took almost 6 years for anyone to be fully trained in historical materialism or economic, political economy. In fact, Nadia sent a letter to friends of his in Russia, the Soviet Union, in 1947 saying, do you guys have any textbooks on historical materialism, perhaps in European languages? English, French, German? They didn't even have materials to be able to teach the classes. That lasted for a couple of years. So I guess what I'm contradicting myself a little bit because I'm talking about all the complexities of the building up the new state, but I still think we need to think about it in terms of this process of modernization of a large state, that in any society which is building up a new whole entire bureaucracy, we have to look at it in those terms, right? Again, because we have a tendency to focus on brutality, we don't give credence to the idea that this was a very straightforward modernization project. So, and furthermore, I guess I would just say that we need to take Philip Abrams' caution from decades ago and not fall for the myth of a unified state apparatus, right? The state loves to represent itself, well, people represent the state as an omnipotent and unified actor, which is, of course, not true. I think people are often at odds with one another. And it was certainly true for the party to represent itself as completely in control on top of all affairs, right? But if you're studying the party state, it's extremely important in my mind to make sure you're paying attention to all the different kinds of activities and all the different kinds of groups that were involved, the party level, the central authority, the local level in the county, and so on, because it's a very complex bureaucratic structure. In other words, what I want to say is we need to think more carefully about what was going on at a practical level, right? Right. So when I was first starting to go in the work in the archives at the Party Institute, or in the Institute for Historical Research, they said, well, just read the documents that were for the Central Committee. And both the dissident historians and the old-fashioned party historians said the same thing. And I'm thinking, why would I read everything from? They don't tell me anything. You have to go down far enough so that you're reading where the bureaucrats are writing policies, debating the policies, turning around. So if you don't take the time to actually, inspect all those kinds of things, you really don't know what's going on a daily basis. It's very interesting. There was a woman who was in charge of she only graduated in 1952. She was a student of Nod at the Economic University, and she was in charge of the labor department. And, I wanted to make sure, I'm an anthropologist. I hadn't done history like this before, so I wanted to make sure I was very aware of what was going on in the present. So I used to say to myself, well, I wonder if she went to the theater last night. Does she have a daughter? I just wanted to make sure I was sticking in the present and not assume that people knew in 1952 what they knew in 1955. So I went to see András Hegedűs at one point to interview him about all these issues. And I said, well, I sure wish I had found out what Lonti György was like. And he goes, well, she lives down the street. She lived 2 blocks away from me. It was great. So I went to visit her. It was very nice. But anyway, the point is to think of the way in which people are inhabiting these offices, right? This may not be something that I need to emphasize in this group, but I think there's very strong tendency not to people these institutions with someone that we would recognize for our own experience, but to make cardboard caricatures of them. And I guess I'm just simply saying we need to discard the Orientalism of the Cold War, right? In other words, we have to reject the notion that these socialist documents were exotic or radically different than any kind of state document in any other place, right? This tendency to treat socialism as an exceptional political or economic condition, I think, has gotten in the way of our being able to compare institutions across different societies, right? So to understand what were the features that were shared with other kinds of things, were they shared in certain contexts of developing states, were they shared certain ways in other kinds of parts of the world, because it was very, it's always treated as this unusual configuration, right? Now, obviously, socialist societies were a very specific historical configuration. We know this. But what we need to do is understand it in those terms rather than thinking of it as some kind of extremely unusual kind of form. And many of these states, of course, had singular features. The anthropology group, after 1989, the East European Anthropology Special Interest Group did not break up because we knew we were going to be continuing to deal with the legacies of socialism. The Europeans said, oh, come on over. And I said, no, we can't do that yet. So, and of course, this all means that thinking about socialisms outside Europe, so paying much more attention to things like socialist societies in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and so on, and not to mention China. And we're lucky in some respects that with the fall in 1989 of the wall, we can also treat each of these social societies in their own terms. I'm often struck by how different things were, for example, in the GDR than they were in Hungary. Right? You hear that, Romania versus, for example, Czechoslovakia, and being able to appreciate how particular configurations in the bureaucracy and other forms made a big difference. So that's my spiel for making sure we think about the new Stalinist state as a modernizing state. So let me turn to the issue of class dynamics. So there's a German joke which is, who is a communist? It's someone who has given up any hope of ever becoming a capitalist. Right? Now, this is certainly inaccurate because, of course, a lot of people who were communists before the Second World War were themselves what we would call bourgeois or come from wealthy backgrounds. Donat Ferenc, who was a very famous agrarian specialist in Hungary, I was sitting in the ministry or in the Institute for the Study of Cooperatives, and this gentleman walks in, and he's in kind of a tweed suit, and he has a little fox terrier or whatever, and he's walking along. And I go, who is that guy? And he said, well, that's Ferenc, Uncle Ferenc, Uncle Donat. And I go, well, he looks like a gentry. And he goes, well, of course, because that's what he was. It's like, so first of all, understanding that there were people who chose to be communists, even though they could have been capitalists. But I want to make sure that we also remember that there were a lot of very, very poor people who welcomed the socialist state. Right? And in particular, also welcomed collectivization. The village where I did my fieldwork was a very poor village. It was dominated by the manorial estate. I was in Fejér County, in which 61% of the land was in manorial control. So a lot of the people, a wealthy family had 10 acres. Right? And you had a lot of people who were migrant laborers, day laborers, and large numbers of people who you would call manorial servants, cseléd, who lived out in the manorial estate and never came into town. Right? Now, we have a lot of articles about the excesses of forced deliveries and depriving landowning peasants of subsistence, the arbitrariness of designating someone as a kulak. There was someone in the village who was essentially a almost impoverished peasant in 1945. He had a large family. He got 25 acres of land. And then when, like 3 years later, because he had very good land, he was declared a kulak. So for example, there were things like that that happened all the time. But I think far less attention has been paid to those who welcomed collectivization, right? Who saw collectivization as a way of running a viable farm. Many of the people who lived in manorial estates had never had the opportunity to work their own land. They were at a severe disadvantage because they didn't have hoes, they didn't have plows. It made it very difficult for them to start up cooperative farms. But they felt very strongly about it because it was also a rise in the dignity of themselves, that they would now be at least considered somewhat or closer and equal to the peasants, because they also would be people who were working in agriculture. Now, these cooperative farms were never very successful. They were always subsidized by the state. So I'm not saying that people who welcomed this kind of collectivization were very prosperous, but I do think it's important that we recognize that there were those people. And in fact, I talk about this in my more recent book, that there was essentially a class, kind of struggle in 1953-54 when a lot of the cooperative farms were being dismantled. And the peasants would say, I want to take my land back. And the people who had been manorial servants says, that is owned by everybody because they own it by virtue of having worked on it. The fact that you owned it was completely irrelevant. But of course, the people who had been landowning peasants, owning land was, of course, the reason that they were, their raison d'etre, right? So you have very strong kind of different views about what's the value of labor, what contributes to the labor. And a lot of those dynamics are missing in the literature. Of course, the cooperatives were not successful in the early 50s. People who continued to farm were much more productive all throughout, even though they were subject to extensive forced deliveries, right? So it's just a simple plea that we pay more attention to poor people for whom socialism was not the end of the world, but in fact opened up all kinds of possibilities for them in their lives. And more generally, if we shift our attention to the national level and to think about the enormity of economic changes in the 1950s, I think I've only read once an article, and it was a long time ago, that talked about what this meant in terms of huge social mobility. I mean, it's obvious, and perhaps we just assume it, but I think it's extremely important to talk about the shift in people's experiences between 1950 and, let's say, 1960 through the process of industrialization. Most people who lived in villages had no water, they didn't have electricity, right? They had almost, they didn't have any of the advantages. They moved to the city. Even if they're in a workers' hostel, they now have plumbing, right? They now have electricity, right? They have a pension, which is a big deal. So I think because, my snide comment is always that intellectuals have written this history and they don't pay attention to what it was like for poor people. But it's extremely important, I think, for us to recognize this. Now, that does not mean that when these people moved to the city, they liked the kind of work that they were doing in the city, right? We know very well that people were very, very critical of wage increases and all kinds of things. But in Hungary, 2/3 of people working in agriculture prior to the World War II had no land or almost none. It was referred to by one writer as a country of 3 million beggars. So those people coming into collective farms, right? Those people moving into the city, sending sons to work in the city so they could stay in the thing, was a huge change in social mobility, right? But as I said, that does not mean that they necessarily like the kind of work conditions they were living, right? They liked the fact that they could go home and they had running water and they might even have had hot water. But the work that they were doing on a lot of sites was arduous, back-breaking, and dirty, right? So here's another joke. So what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? It's the self-rule, or in the same word, the self-restraint of the working class, right? So they're holding them back. Workers were very, very explicit about their concerns about wages and so on. Mark Pittaway's excellent scholarship has lots of examples of that. But of course, the Communist Party always attributed any complaints to social democrats, right? They always said, oh, no, true workers would never make those kinds of complaints, but that's just not true. So I guess it's a very simple point that I think we need to be more attentive to those kinds of experiences of radically changing the character of one's everyday life. That you have, you can go into a heated room, right, at night, right? You might be able to have, You could maybe buy food in the store. You didn't have to raise it. These are all major changes for most of the people who were involved in that process of industrialization. And it's important for us to emphasize it. Now, people's enthusiasm about these changes didn't last very long. So there's another joke which says, what is communism? It is a line connecting 2 points which is constantly receding. Right? So it's always, right? And a friend of mine had a companion joke which I liked. And he said, can you imagine the slaves in Rome going, we want feudalism, we want feudalism. So, you know, great. So people became increasingly disillusioned about the possibility that their lives would improve beyond what had happened already in the 50s, right? So another joke was, you know, who came up with the idea of scientific socialism? They said it's certainly not scientists because they would have tried it on rats first, right? The experiments. So, but I also want to say that the cynicism about communist propaganda, right, did not necessarily dampen people's enthusiasm for socialism in principle, right? Many people, for example, in the village where I did fieldwork, thought socialism was a great idea, right? There was a man who worked out at the manorial estate who was in the dairy barn. He had to be at work at 3 o'clock in the morning and he'd get home at 11 o'clock at night. He never saw his children awake the whole time they were growing up, right? So for him, he said, I wish socialism had come 500 years before, right? But what they thought socialism was not necessarily what they were living in, right? Now, certainly in terms of agriculture, collectivization was cooperative farming was a very effective and, of course, in Hungary, very productive enterprise. And I asked people in the village, would you like to go back to being private farmers? Now, of course, many of these people didn't own land before the war, so it doesn't make any sense. But no one did. Because of mechanization, they didn't have to work so hard. You know, they had you know, regular wages and so on. But in more general terms, they thought that socialism meant secure employment, healthcare, and decent pensions. They thought that was a great idea, right? But this is not the way in which they were living in socialism, right? And people in the village would often say, we're the ones who work with our hands. We provide the nation with food, right? Or we're the ones the Communist Party is constantly praising, right? But we're still at the bottom of the barrel because policemen, party members, people who don't work with their hands, which is what they consider legitimate work, were always paid more. Right? People liked the idea of socialism, but saw that it wasn't being realized. And I talk about this at great length in my first book, where I talk about what happens when a state represents itself as a science and what happens with planning and how it breeds all kinds of cynicism, right? Now, I must say that, you know, and this was exacerbated, the people, difficulties they had in everyday life of, you know, being, treated with very little respect, was also exacerbated by scarcity, when people couldn't have access to things. Now, as someone who was raised in capitalism, I could never understand why every winter during the flu epidemic, there was not enough Kleenex. So I would ask people, I said, how come there's not enough Kleenex? And they go, well, I said, why don't they make more? And they go, but because then they'll have to make more. And I'm going, what's the problem with that? I don't understand, right? But of course, this meant that if you had difficulties with supply chains, you couldn't assume that you would make more, right? It was very hard to achieve what was important, which was the brute normative increase, right? So you didn't want to put yourself in a situation where you were forced to do more, right? These issues of how to actually deal with planning and so on is expressed in another joke. So this is a Polish joke, and a party official visits a state farm to find out how the harvest was progressing. He said, well, comrade, he says, how do things look? And he goes, we're going to have twice as much of a harvest as last year. And he said, but last year's harvest was 0. And he goes, yeah, 2 times 0 is 0. I strongly recommend you look at Janusz Kennedy's book, Build It Yourself. It's a marvelous story of the ways in which people had to get around forms of scarcity. How did you find bricks if you had to go across the country if you were building a house? The title is built on the expression in the 1950s is the country is yours, build it yourself. But as in the 70s and 80s, the state was no longer investing in housing, right? So people literally had to do that building themselves. It's a marvel. I can't follow it. It gets so baroque in the way in which you had to do all these elaborate calculations. But he has this great line where he said, if the state didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, you know, because they have to constantly be stealing from the state to be able to have any success in work, right? And of course, as we know, scarcity was a particularly serious problem in relationship to food, right? So here's a Romanian joke. So an elderly gentleman comes into the grocery store and he asks, do you have any herring? I go, no. Do you have any bananas? No. Do you have any caviar? No. The next day he comes in and he says, do you have any bananas? No. Do you have any herring? No. Do you have any caviar? And the third day he comes in and finally the clerk says to the other guy, he says, that guy is nuts. He goes, yeah, but what a memory. You know? So, or the other joke about how before the war, a butcher shop had the name Kovac on the outside and meat inside. In the socialist period, they had meat outside and Kovac was inside. Didn't know he did. So these are all very, you know, pressing problems, particularly, you know, of course, we know in Romania and Poland. It was not as much an issue in Hungary, certainly not in the village. Right? On Sundays, in the 1980s, you'd sit down and you'd start with soup, and then you'd have the chicken that had been cooked in the soup, and then you had pork chops, and then you had these very elaborate meals, right? When my husband came to visit me in the village, he thought that he was being force-fed because this is the time of year when they're force-feeding the geese. You know, oh, I can't take it anymore. So, but what accounts for this bounty? In rural communities, people were able to feed their family as a result of a lot of very hard work. People engaged in all kinds of contracts with the state, as you probably know, that, you know, you'd raise 30 pigs and then you'd sell them at a fixed price, and it was a very easy way for the state to complement the grain production of cooperative farms and so on. It, you know, sustained that hybrid economy that was characterized, you know, the second economy and the first economy in 1980s Hungary. And of course, you also had the huge effort and boom in housing construction of the period. Now, I would often hear people in the city say that, oh, those villagers, they're just a bunch of stingy people, right? But in fact, they didn't recognize that all this hard work that they've been engaged in was the only way that their social mobility would increase in the 1960s to the 1980s. Everything they did was on their own behalf because the state never invested in these communities in the same way. Right? The state always had subsidized metro tickets, for example. The buses were not subsidized in the same way. So the only reason that villages started to look like, you know, some houses in the city having electricity, water piped in, central heating, indoor bathrooms, was all due to how hard people worked. They would get up about 4 p.m. or 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. They'd feed the animals around the house because a lot of people had animals to, you know, supplement the hybrid economy. Then they'd go to a job and be there for 8 or 10 hours. And then they'd get home, and then they'd spend another 4 to 5 hours working in the garden and taking care of the animals. So I made the mistake of not getting interviews going before mid-February. I come from Minnesota, so, you know, spring starts in like late April. So I thought I had plenty of time to talk. As of mid-February, I was out in the fields, in their backyards. I could not do any interviews until the following fall because people weren't always working, right? And of course, during the 1980s in particular, a lot of people with trades, electricians, carpenters, bricklayers, moved back to rural communities, right? They have a job at a local industrial, you know, place, right? And they would, you know, it would take them 3 days to put a door in, you know, at their workplace. But then on the weekend, they would do it like in 2 hours, right? So they just lazed around at their formal job, and then they came home, and then they worked, you know, all those weekends to earn money privately. But of course, this meant that I have friends who worked every single day for 30, 40, 50 years, and their bodies were shot, right? But this is the way that they were able to accumulate the kind of capital that they needed to get by, right? People in the cooperative farms didn't even have pensions or health care until 1965. So the tendency to kind of dismiss villagers as stingy obscures the fact that they were very actively involved in pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Something that people in the city just did not recognize. So let me turn to the, and again, this is this whole issue of not paying attention to the class dimensions of people who live in the countryside, which is my pet peeve, as you can tell. So let me turn to the final point that I want to make about the separation of the public and private affairs in late socialism. So here's the joke. Cohn is called into the manager's office at the factory, and the manager says, "Cohn, you have done an excellent job as the union steward." He goes, "But when I looked at your dossier, I saw that you're not a member of the Communist Party." And Cohn said, "Yeah, well, yeah, it's like this, you know. During the war, my mother ran a whorehouse. She cooked, she cleaned, she took care of all affairs, but she wasn't a whore." Right? So, you know, this whole idea of being involved with be engaged in the party, right, was considered a disreputable activity, right? The only people who joined the party were people who were looking to advance their careers. And in the 1980s in particular, there was this very strong contrast between what was seen to be the sullied public economy and activities, involvement with the state, and the increasingly, sacred home life, which was actually also accompanied by a lot of anti-feminism. But a friend of mine has a great dissertation on the anti-feminism, the anti-politics of anti-feminism, which starts in the early 80s. But anyway, the point is that there's this, very strong contrast between the public and the private. The private was the place where people were seen to be in charge of themselves, but of course, it's a patriarchy, so what it meant was that men were in charge, even though they used to always say that women held up 3 pillars of the household, right? So dismissal just didn't extend to people's attitudes about the party. People would often disparage the kinds of things that they had to do at their workplace, right? What they're doing, is meaningless. We couldn't, like half the time you didn't have all the right tools, and so you couldn't do the job right, and so on. Lots of people would dream about starting their own small business, but people would often not do it. I asked this guy, he lived right by the railroad station. He had a 2-story house. I said, "Why don't you have a pub in your lower level? You make all this money." He said, "I can't trust the fact that the state that won't change its policies about private business, and I'll turn around and I'll lose all my money." So, and people would also criticize, the kinds of things that their children had to learn at school, right? And so when they'd come home, they'd have to give them different lessons. Now, don't say this about 56 in school, but let me tell you what actually happened, right? And in fact, the best way to describe this is people would say that they were not living in a normal country. People would often say, if this was a normal country, and they'd say, you'd have good, regulations or something. Again, they didn't have a clue what regulations were about in other places. So a bunch of anthropologists, we had a session at the Midwestern Anthropology Association meeting once, to discuss what does it mean when people are living at odds with their own experiences, right? That they don't see anything that they're doing as normal. That there's a normal, in some maybe in the household, but not outside. And people would often talk about this as this kind of split personality or whatever. So we're going on and on. This is in the early 90s, and Marko Živković, who came from Belgrade, he said, "Can I just say something? I just came to the United States, and you guys think you live in a normal country, and there's people running around with guns all the place." It's just great. So he saw it a little bit different. So, but I want to make the point that this tendency to talk about the private and the public as separated did not actually characterize the way in which people lived. And I think this is often overlooked, right? People would often use this division as a rhetorical strategy, right? So they would talk about different imaginaries that were possible, that those that are offered by the Communist Party. You know, I used to go to these flying university meetings. You know, you'd go to someone's house and a bunch of people would be sitting around on the floor and you'd read, you know, important works by Bebo or other important philosophers. You know, this is all about the anti-politics of Havel and Michnik and Conrad, this whole idea that you have to have an alternative vision of what politics could be like, that it couldn't be what the state is like, right? But you also had people who actually got involved in altering different kinds of relationships. There was a very active but small group of people who were regularly giving legal advice to workers in factories. Because, you know, wealthier folks, academics, cultural elites, if they needed to have some, you know, legal issues dealt with, they could do it, or they just called their friends and took care of these issues. But poor people did not have those advantages. So they established a special legal community. A lot of people were working very strongly with Roma communities to improve their experiences. And you even have a group of renegade Catholics who would meet in what were called small communities. This is essentially liberation theology. They hated the Catholic hierarchy, and they would get together and do kinds of things. So there were all kinds of efforts to have a different kind of alternative realm of civic action outside the control of the purview of the party state, but it was very limited in number. And I think we've heard in many of the talks that I think there was a civil society during the socialist period, and we need to talk about that more too. You also heard these same complaints in the village about people saying, you know, I was standing once with Yoshka, my friend, who was there was a good party secretary and a bad party secretary. Yoshka was the good party secretary. So we're standing and he said, you know, what would be great if I could just grow tobacco and, you know, do all that kind of stuff. Yoshka, that's private enterprise, you know. And so his dad was standing there, oh yeah, the priest, you know, preaches water and drinks wine, you know. He said, my son was either going to be a priest or party member, but so people wanted to have this sense. And I talk about this a lot in my first book about people wanting to be masters of themselves. That if they can control their own activities, that gave them a sense of integrity, right? But it would be misleading if we actually took their complaints as accurate representations of what life was like. Everybody went to school, everybody went to work. Their activities in those places were productive, were consequential. People lived and created these new worlds. And for me, part of the argument about the public-private that continued into the 1990s was this argument that was, you know, socialism was, you know, this hiatus that's irrelevant. You know, we just need to go back to the old bourgeois kind of forms of things, without thinking that there are 40 years of people's social process, social construction of this new world, which was radically different than it had been in 1945. So we can't take people's description of this, you know, late socialism as all doom and gloom and, oh my God, let's get out of the party, as if people walked around as alienated drones or zombies, right? People had happy lives in all kinds of ways. They did all kinds of fun things. They were very involved. They might have even liked their job. They might have liked their teacher. All of those, but my point is that all of these have consequences for the social process, for social change, right? So, you know, you could say, I'll just quote Marx from the 18th Brumaire. He says, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. So people were engaged in all these activities on a regular basis. A lot of people very much enthusiastically. But to dismiss the 40 years of socialism, like a lot of people did in the 1990s, is just a travesty. It has absolutely no historical or social value analytically. Now, of course, I'm preaching to the crowd, so it's a little bit awkward. But I'm just making a simple point that what people say about their lives and what they're doing are not the same thing necessarily. This is a basic principle of anthropology. You know, you listen to what people say and then you watch what they do. Right? So we need to look beyond the everyday chit-chat. And everybody who was talking about public-private in the 1980s assumed that this was a relevant description of everyday life and not assuming that it was a rhetorical move. Right? And of course, so in all of the marvelous papers that we've heard in the conference, we see this richness and complexity of social life. And I'm very grateful for all the scholarship you did and for taking people's lives and socialism seriously. So I'd like to end by taking Esther's challenge to say that we need to think about what worked in socialism, right? And what maybe doesn't work in liberal societies. So this is an absolutely classic joke. So Gurun comes back. He's been living in Israel. He comes back to Hungary. He runs into his old friend Kohn. He goes, Kohn, you must tell me, what is socialism like? And he goes, good. He said, no, I want a more extensive description. Not so good. Right? So that's it. Thank you. I'm done. I don't know if people want to ask questions. Okay, fine.
Well, I have a lot of friends in the startup economy. A lot of my friends are actually business people. They tell me 60% of all businesses fail.
That's right.
It's a systematic thing. It's discussed
right.
How capital works from day one. And all of the startups, they say, for between 5 to 10 years, they don't even have to profit. They remain subsidized by the investors,
That's
almost
right.
perpetually.
That's
I
right.
keep thinking of like so-called startup, like so-called as a startup. It is subsidized and it might be inefficient, but it's okay. Just like we accept the failures of capitalism, we should not be averted by the failures of socialism because it's okay now anyway. Yes, I don't know. Why do you start? Where is this independence from? One acceptance whether the other unacceptance.
Well, I mean, partly, of course, it has to do with the fact that people themselves hadn't been in capitalism and hadn't talked to people who, let's say, had invested in a business and lost it. Because in the United States, people don't talk about that. And the whole ideology is that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is just, it's so offensive, it's ridiculous. There's no social mobility, or virtually no social mobility in the United States, right? But everyone says, well, if I work hard and if I get there, and of course, the problem is not only that they don't recognize the structural conditions that make it impossible for them to move up, but they also individuate their responsibility. So they say, I'm responsible, and therefore I didn't work. So a lot of it has to do with just ignorance. I was sitting and talking to a dissident once, and he said, nobody in socialism has a good relationship with their boss. And I go, nobody in capitalism has a good relationship with their boss. And he goes, let's find a third way. Of course, I don't like that expression because it means something else. But that was the problem. But people were not willing to think about the possibilities. I mean, Kim Schepele, you might know her work. She did a lot of study on law in Hungary. And she said she looked at early correspondence and all these things that people were writing in 1991, and they were saying, in a normal country, this regulation would not exist, and you would be able to do this, 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 this. And then, of course, you'd look at the German economy, and they had exactly the same kind of regulation. So people had very idealized and unsupported kind of understandings of what life was like in capitalist societies. In fact, I think that one way of thinking about it is that a lot of people in late 1980s in Hungary thought what they were going to get was 1970s welfare capitalism in Germany. But that, by the 1990s, you didn't have that kind of welfare capitalism. Of course, I used to get so frustrated. They'd say, well, we just can't afford to do those welfare things. And I go, what? You're worried about the rate of profit? I mean, what do you mean there's no money, right? That's so they're so disillusioned. And part of what we talk about in that article where we talk about jokes is the intense level of disillusionment that has led not only to people's alienation, but also conspiracy theories and all kinds of explaining all kinds of things. It's a very vicious cycle, and that's independent even of Orban, who just is a catastrophe. So, but yeah, I think that's absolutely true that people don't know, and a lot of people, even I think in business schools, they say that if you get an undergraduate degree in economics, you're you don't know much about economics, right? You get all these idealized, classical kind of studies of economics, and you don't actually learn how things work. I said to a friend of mine once, who's a political scientist, I said, well, I'm interested in markets. And she goes, why don't you read a economics textbook. And I go, that's the last thing I would do to be able to figure out what a market was like. So, but the sad thing precisely is that they expected things to be better. Now, in the village, they didn't expect things to be better. They knew they were going to get screwed. And I remember Yoshka, my buddy, who was, the good party secretary, said to me, he said, Marta, you should be studying capitalism. It's so fascinating. He was buying up land and doing all these things. And I said, Yoshka, I know what capitalism looks like. A few people will be wealthy and everybody else will be really poor. And that's, of course, what happened. And it was particularly hard for people in the village where, in the 1930s, before the war, if you had a good harvest, you had more food, right? And that was true during the war, right? And then that was also true in socialism. You could sell it off to the Soviet Union, right? So and also because of the character of economic kind of planning and thinking, people thought about things as having fixed value, right? And so when they get, after 89 and they get in and now the price of wheat is dependent not on state subsidies, but on world markets, they'd have more wheat and they'd make less money and people just didn't understand what it meant. It's interesting, a friend had told me about this great anecdote from the parliament, I think in 91 or 92. There was a big debate going on about selling Ibus, which had been the travel agency in Hungary. It had been sold to an Austrian firm. And people were saying, these people were corrupt. They should have gotten more money. And a very famous economist who was a member of the parliament at that point got up and he said, let me explain something to you. The value of a company is what you can sell it for. And they go, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard, because everything was supposed to have a fixed value. And so that, for peasants in particular, was just awful because it just, the whole rug was pulled out from underneath their economy. Yes?
Long time ago, I was working for a while in Moscow. And every Friday afternoon, we have to come to the general director's office. So we all got halfway to our vodka. We had to finish that before we left. And it took hours for me. In any case, then they started to tell jokes, anecdotes. And the interesting thing for me was two things. One is they had numbered the anecdotes. So someone said, tell again, anecdote 29. And they already started laughing because they knew.
Yeah.
And so this is a kind of ritualization of the joke. The other thing was that there was so much racism in these jokes, especially about the Chukchin and the Soviet Union. Can you tell us something about the joke telling as such?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's that classic joke about three Jews are traveling on a train and one guy says, 15, ha, 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 ha. The other one says, 39, whoa, whoa, whoa. The third guy said, 62. So, we didn't like your delivery, because everybody knows it, right? So the joke I told about being a whore was told by the director of the Institute of Ethnography, right? So one of the things I talk about in that joke party is that a lot of people with very powerful positions would tell those jokes. Of course, they didn't have less power by telling the joke, but it made them look like they were, part of the everyday guy, right? There is a joke that I wanted to tell, but I was worried that it would be offensive, but I'll go ahead and tell it. So we're in the school for idiots, right? And all year long, they learn about bunnies. So where do bunnies live? What do they eat? How do they socialize with other groups, right? And at the end of the year, the teacher brings in a little bunny. And she says, okay, kids, what's this? She goes, we've been talking about it all year. So Moritz raises his hand. He said, don't tell me it's Comrade Lenin in person. You see this little bunny. Right? But yeah, I mean, see, it's that kind of telling of hours and hours. And it was and that's absolutely gone. It doesn't exist anymore in the same way. And of course, it has to do with social media and a few other things, and also a lot of class differences. I mean, you can look at, but it's sad because it really was a very pleasurable activity. Anyone else have a question? All right, very good. Let's go eat.